Hi, and welcome to Lesson 6 of the Humanities online course. So what we'll be talking about in this lesson are three themes that go together within the particular historical genre which we'll be studying. We'll be looking first at the age of war that occurs, that we all know, within the 20th century, the First and the Second World Wars. We'll be looking at psychotherapy, which develops initially through Sigmund Freud and through other psychologists. And you'll be reading, of course, in this course, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. We'll be discussing that a bit. And finally, we'll be looking at Surrealism, which is a particular style of art that develops out of that period and out of psychotherapy, which begins to look to the subconsciousness as a subject matter for the exploration and expression of artistic inclinations. So let's get started. So part one, the age of war. To get a context for this, we need to kind of see, well, if we look at something like the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideals, we have to ask ourselves, well, how is it that from these ideals we evolved into something like the ideals that marked National Socialism, okay, within World War II? Well, we do find some roots for that, and indeed these roots evolve out of the changing ideals about the nature of the human being that begins to develop within the early 19th century and later within the 20th century. And a good starting point here is with Charles Darwin, okay, who was a naturalist, certainly and a geologist, so certainly he can't be blamed, but his ideas on evolution, which we'll be looking at briefly, become popularized and adapted in various ways, both in a social and political context. And for example, the later Nazis begin to adapt notions of evolution to bloodline and to different races. And so they begin to use this in their propaganda, and indeed they use it in the end, toward the end of World War II, in the commission of acts of genocide. So we see that Darwin here, 1809 to 82, he's a naturalist and a geologist, and he published a very famous work, which everyone should be familiar with, his On the Origin of the Species, in 1859. You'll notice that this appears some 10 years after Karl Marx and Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, and where Marx dealt with the historical development of societies. Darwin, on the other hand, as we'll see, he deals with the historical development of the species. So there's this interest in history and historical development that starts to become popular during that time, a kind of awareness of how history influences our present-day activities. We see this both in Marx and we see this in Darwin as well. So with this work, Darwin really single-handedly revolutionizes biology, and it stimulates, as I say, development of the social sciences and will challenge key elements of religious thought. For example, the notion of creationism, which is in the text of the Genesis in the Old Testament, which suggests that the world was created by God within 7 days. So it begins to challenge certain religious themes such as that. Now, just a brief overview of the basic principles or terms or concepts of Darwin's theory of evolution. So one of the things that you have to recognize is that Darwin's theory is going to be backed by substantial evidence. And one of the amazing things is that he actually collected most of the evidence himself by sailing to portions of Africa and other areas within the world. And you can imagine how difficult that must have been during that time, collecting that type of evidence. I mean, he has a lot of evidence which he produces in support of his theories. So what he argues is basically the species, for example, the human species, a species of dog or bird, etc., are mutable. In other words, they're changeable. and that the species change throughout history. He argues that the species evolve from other species through small changes over time, and that this involves a slow process of organic evolution. So for Darwin, we see that the species now, the human species, for example, will be subject to change, so that in 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years, the species will in fact evolve to become something different from what it is now. So in offering this theory, Darwin will also offer certain biological natural principles. And these principles are the fundamental principles, the primary principles are those of competition and natural selection. So it's a very simple idea here. We can look at a game and we can say, well, who's going to win the game? And you can say, well, the players that will win the game are the players that are generally better and so play better. And so in doing so, they win the game because of their superior skill. So in many ways, this is what Darwin is arguing about nature, basically that all of the natural organisms are competing, first of all, for the natural resources, for food, for example, or for sunlight, nutrition. And in doing so, those organisms which play the game better, which are better in the competition, will win, and in winning, they will be able to breed and to propagate the species, okay? So to reproduce and to pass on their genes. So in many ways, it's a very simple theory. It's a very simple idea which Darwin has, and it has certainly far-reaching consequences. So this notion of competition, again, is that, well, the species must compete for natural resources, and the notion of natural selection is that those who are better at playing the game, in other words, the skilled players, will ultimately win, pass on their genes, and those who are unskilled will die, and so they won't pass on their genes, and so those species who don't pass on their genes don't thrive within the future. Okay? Now, moving away from Darwin, so we see just a basic idea of Darwin's theory of evolution there. We have Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, and he is an English philosopher. And what's interesting about Spencer is he's going to work out a theory of social evolution. So remember, Darwin has worked out a theory of natural or biological evolution. Spencer works out, and in fact worked out, a theory of social evolution. In fact, before Darwin actually publishes his theory of biological evolution. It was in fact Herbert Spencer who coins the famous expression, which most of you should be familiar with, the survival of the fittest, that those who are fittest, strongest, more skilled will survive within the competition for the natural resources to pass on their genes. And he actually coins this, Spencer, in an 1852 essay, and Darwin will later adopt and add this term to a new edition of his work, so that's an interesting historical tidbit. So what Herbert Spencer thus works out is this notion of social Darwinism. And basically he applies evolutionary theory to the evolution not of biological species, but of social groups, races, and nations, okay? Now, so what you want to think about here is, okay, what is evolution saying? It's saying that the species are going to evolve and that those who are strongest and best fit to survive will be the ones who pass on their genes to evolve. So Spencer now is going to adapt this to social groups. So he's going to say that basically cultures, okay, or countries or nations, okay, also evolve and pass on their genes. In other words, that nations will live, to become another nation, a bit different, but still live to be that nation in some way, shape, or form. And that those nations that are superior, that are best fit for survival, will be the ones to actually pass on their genes, in other words, to survive the next 100 years. All right, so now the difference is that certainly for Darwin, he's a naturalist and a biologist, and he just offers his theory of evolution as a certain description of nature. With Spencer, however, Spencer offers his theory of social Darwinism not just as a description of social evolution, but rather he offers a prescriptive aspect. In other words, he prescribes rules and norms for how societies should act based upon his theory. So in other words, what Spencer basically says is, look, societies are evolving, and superior, stronger societies are going to be the ones that thrive. Weaker societies are going to perish. And so that's the descriptive aspect. And then the prescriptive aspect is he says, well, based upon that fact, we should take every precaution to make sure that we're a strong society and that we survive. And in doing so, he calls for some radical changes with government. He calls for the elimination of government programs to assist the poor and the inferior. And in doing so, he suggests in eliminating these programs, the inferior will pass away, and so the nation will be full of, well, strong individuals, and so the nation itself will thrive. So now what I want you to do is to think about how these ideas are so radically different from the ideas which we saw in the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, okay, which led to the revolutions in the French Revolution, and the ideas espoused in the American and French Revolutions, which were written in the Bill of Rights and the discussion on the rights of man, you see that what they're suggesting is that all human beings are equal. We have freedom. We have natural dignity. Okay. Now you see these other views coming up with Darwin, especially Spencer, his notion of social Darwinism. What he's saying is, look, human beings are not equal, rather we're unequal, and some are strong and some are weak. And he's saying that what we should do is we should allow the weak to perish. We shouldn't help them at all. The strong should not help the weak, but rather kind of trample upon them. And in doing so, we allow our group to thrive and to live on, to move on. So you can see how an idea like this would begin to affect and in some ways infect the cultural ideas of the time, so that it begins to evolve into something like National Socialism, which says that, well, certain races are superior to others, for example, the Aryan race, and that this race deserves to thrive, whereas other races should perish. And this is why we see, for example, such things as the concentration camps during World War II and the murder of millions of Jews and Gypsies and other individuals. So you see some kind of roots in these changing ideas about the human being. So what we also have during these times is a new age of imperialism, which around 1950 until the First World War in 1914. Now this age is fueled by a number of causes. Okay, one is, I mark here, is a need for economic expansion. So what's going to happen is that capitalism and capitalist systems require increasing markets in order to have increasing profits. Otherwise, capitalism will ultimately collapse. And so this is something that Marx had predicted. And so in order to obtain new resources and raw material, what's going to happen is that countries like Great Britain, for example, countries like France are going to need to expand into other markets, for example, markets whether in India or in Africa or Asia. And so we see this new age of imperialism where these countries begin to go into these other countries and begin to harvest, in a way, their natural resources for the sake of profit. Okay? So what we see also is an increase of competition among these state powers, and this makes sense based upon the fact that all of these countries, especially in Europe and also in the US and Russia, these countries are beginning to expand their markets, and so expanding markets naturally results in competition. But of course, competition, especially on an economic level, is going to result in hostility among nations, because now we're competing for the same resources. And well, let's say that this one country is obtaining that resource and this other country wants it and can't obtain it, let's say by the normal means, then maybe that country, which has a stronger military, can take it by other means, for example, by force. So you see these types of movements begin to increase in Europe at the time. And third, we do see some humanitarian interests, which is a form of imperialism, where Christian missionaries begin to go to areas of Asia and Africa. But I note here that some of the ideals of some of these missionaries were tainted with notions of social Darwinism, and so it justified, for example, conquering quote-unquote barbaric peoples. And we see in 1904 in Hamburg in Germany that Samoan women were actually exhibited in the zoo. So you see that there's some really odd changing ideas about the nature of the human being, that these ideas within the Enlightenment start to be covered again, and kind of hierarchical groups and classes of human beings begin to become espoused as the new principles of that age. And ultimately, this age of competition, this age of which begins to reinforce ideals of human inequality, leads eventually to competition and war. All right? And so we have then World War I. Now, I'm not going to go over these wars in too much detail, just brief overviews, so you could actually take a class on each of these wars in itself. So World War I, I'm just going to give you kind of the causes and the results. It was 1914 to 1918. Now, when we look at the world at the time, we see that it was divided, at least Europe at the time, including Russia, was divided into two fundamental powers. There was a kind of balance of power at the time, and the one was the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers, composed of Germany, Austria, and Italy, and the other was the Triple Entente, or the Allies, composed of Russia, France, and England. Now, the important point to recognize here is that Russia is going to also be aligned with Serbia in order to offset the Ottoman Empire. And so what we see is that the war actually begins with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand while he was in Bosnia at the time, reviewing troops. And a Serbian nationalist was actually behind the assassination, and so Austria, at the time, you see Austria is aligned with the Triple Alliance, blames Serbia, and notice that Serbia is aligned with Russia. And in doing so, Austria declares war on Serbia, and because Russia is aligned with Serbia, Russia then mobilizes in defense of Serbia, and of course Germany, in defense of its ally Austria, mobilizes in defense of Austria, and you see kind of the ball, the rolls on, and it leads to World War. Right? So the results of the First World War, and this is interesting from the perspective of industrialization and the new technology, etc., is that we see new military technology leads to, in fact, wide-scale destruction. We have machine guns, poison gas, Zeppelin air raids, submarines, and over 10 million people are going to be killed. The war ends basically for two fundamental reasons, and here this is interesting. 1917 was mentioned already, because we saw that Marx's manifesto was written and Engels' manifesto was written in 1848. In 1917, that manifesto finally takes practical worldwide effect with the Russian Communist Revolution. And because Russia was a fundamental part of the war with the revolution, this kind of brought Russia out of the First World War. The second thing that leads to the end of the war is the U.S. entry in April 1917. And so the U.S. gives substantial aid to its allies, and German submarines, as a prelude to this, the U.S. was hesitant, as in World War II, to enter the war, but the U.S. is also secretly giving aid to its allies, and the German submarines begin to sink U.S. ships, which eventually forces the U.S. to enter the war against Woodrow Wilson's original vow. Okay? So let's just move straight into World War II. Again, we'll look at some of the causes and some of the effects. So World War II now is 1939 to 1945. So what's going to happen is at the end of World War I, Germany will be kind of one of the main countries during the war which will become problematic. And this will result in the Treaty of Versailles, 28th of June 1919, in which Germany is wrongly blamed for World War I. We saw what the origins were. It was in relation to Austria and Russia and Serbia. And this treaty was largely punitive. In other words, it was largely a treaty which punished Germany, okay, again, wrongly, for the war itself. Now, the basic reason is that the Germans gave the most problems during the war, and they were generally one of the strongest countries and posed the strongest opposition during the war. So the result of the treaty was that German territory was reduced and stripped of its colonial territories. The Germans were forced to repay war payments, and the army and the military production was strictly limited. So basically, when you really look at all of these punishments from the treaty, what it actually resulted in was the destruction of the German economy. Okay, and this is what leads to countrywide depression, and it leads to humiliation and resentment in Germany. Now, you can look at countries today and you can see, for example, if you go and you look at Greece and you see the kinds of economic sanctions that are occurring in Greece at present today, you see that there is a lot of economic depression, a lot of resentment in contemporary Greece toward the EU, for example, toward its allies. And this is actually leading to increased radicalization within the Greek parliament. Now, when we look back, okay, in 1919, 1920s, within Germany, we see that something similar happens here, that we have countrywide depression, we have a lot of anger, and this is going to lead to the radicalization of the government so that the National Socialists, through Adolf Hitler, will actually rise to power and, in fact, will be voted into the German government because the citizens are basically angry at what's happening and they're looking for radical change. And here's a picture of Adolf Hitler here. Very interesting individual. He started off as, I believe, an architect, was unsuccessful, and eventually found success in politics. So Hitler and National Socialism. So in Germany, we see that National Socialism begins to gain ground, and a lot of the views of National Socialism are going to be written during a time in which Hitler is actually jailed, and they'll be written in his Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in 1925. Again, it's written in jail after an attempted coup by the Nazis along with Hitler in 1923. The book becomes a national bestseller at the time. I mean, think about this, a national bestseller, and the book is going to intermix nationalism, racist supremacy, and anti-Semitism, and it will also, and this is where it really gets a lot of the strong support, it also condemns harshly the Versailles Treaty and the treatment of the Germans. So what happens is that by 1930, the Nazi Party had gained ground, 37%. And so, actually, as I said, the Nazi Party is going to be voted into the German government, and by with a 37% majority. And you have to recognize that when Hitler first published his book Mein Kampf, I think the majority of Germans kind of overlooked his statements on racist supremacy and anti-Semitism as maybe a bit crazy, as something, well, he doesn't really believe those things. And they kind of just focused on his condemnation of the Versailles Treaty and the treatment that the Germans received. But unfortunately, as history tells us and has shown us, Hitler was in fact very sincere and believed deeply in the views that he does espouse within the Mein Kampf, and in fact brings these views into effect later on within the war. So what we see is that as the Nazi Party gains ground through Hitler, fearing this and hoping to control Hitler, President Hindenburg at the time makes a terrible mistake and appoints Hitler Chancellor and Prime Minister of Germany in 1932. So that he does this as an attempt to control Hitler, but actually the attempt kind of does the opposite in that case. And so what's going to happen is this will lead to brutal oppression by the Nazi Party of the Jews, communists, and any detractors of the party. And in July, in fact, of that year, Hitler is going to declare the Nazi Party the sole party. And after Hindenburg's death in 1933, Hitler assumes the role of both president and chancellor. He will later on also adopt the title Führer, which means leader, after Mussolini, who was then the dictator of Italy, who called himself the El Dulce. So a lot of the ideals of National Socialism, and in fact, were obtained through Mussolini, who was kind of became the example of this type of ruling power at the time. So one of the things that Hitler first espoused during that time was kind of a strong German nation and the unity of the German nations in the German Reich, or the empire. And so initially, Hitler actually received a lot of support from the German people, and a lot of the reasons for this is that Hitler actually provided a lot of jobs for Germans, and indeed he in fact turned the entire economy of the German nation around. But unfortunately, what he also did is he rearms Germany, and he becomes extremely militant. So by 1935, Hitler began rearming Germany, and of course this is against the Versailles Treaty in 1919, which forbid Germany to have a standing army. So in 1936, Germany then allies with Italy and Japan, and in 1938, Hitler and the Nazis marched into Austria unopposed and declared a merger of Austria. Now, when they marched into Austria, you should recognize that the Austrians let them in with cheers and with clapping and with happiness, exultation, because this kind of new age of the German Empire was kind of being reaffirmed. Following this, the Germans later annexed Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, Hitler allies with Stalin, so a communist. Now, you have to recognize that the Nazis were deeply opposed to the communists, and a lot of communists in Germany were sent to concentration camps. Nonetheless, for strategic reasons, 1939, Hitler allies with Stalin, and also Stalin accepts this, and they both agree to split Poland. So the Second World War thus soon begins. So in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And France and Britain, who had been kind of cautiously watching at the time, saw Poland as kind of the final line, and they immediately declare war on Germany. In their invasions, Germany employs new tactics, however, new military tactics that were in fact quite brilliant. They were called blitzkrieg tactics that involved lightning warfare using massive power. And in fact, they took Poland in a single month, and then they proceeded into Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Luxembourg. France itself, which was thought impenetrable, fell to a blitzkrieg in 6 weeks. And in the end, it was England alone who remained the only European survivor. Of course, Italy at the time was allied with Germany. So in December 7th, 1941, we have also this later on, Japan invades Pearl Harbor, bringing the U.S. into war. So of course the U.S. had been resistant to enter the war, just as in the First World War, though the U.S. was secretly aiding the allies of Britain and France. Okay, so this leads to this invasion by the Japanese in 1941. And 1941, June 22nd, we see that shifting away from Britain, Hitler then begins to invade his main object, which is Russia. Now, if we go back and think about the French Revolution, we recall that it was Napoleon who finally brought an end to the French Revolution when he effects a coup d'etat. After being asked to help them out, he comes in and he assumes power. Then he begins to invade most of Europe, and he's quite successful, but he makes a terrible mistake by invading Russia in winter. And interestingly, it would be Hitler who makes the same mistake many years later. And we see that Hitler, in fact, invades Russia. Russia is such a tremendous country, and the idea of occupying Russia, especially during that time, and such large territories, and defending it, certainly during harsh winters, in which you have very few supplies, and in fact the German soldiers were not well supplied, and they did not have the kind of training and equipment to deal with the winter. Well, what happens in 1942 and 43 at the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most terrible battles of the war, in fact, this becomes a turning point because Russia, in fact, turns back the Germans, so this becomes one of the worst and first losses for the Germans during the war, and they turned back the Germans, and they sustained substantial losses, and in fact they sustained more losses than the U.S. Sustained during the entire war. So following this, the cold, severe winter pushes the Germans back, and in June 1944, we have the Normandy invasion, with 130,000 British and U.S. troops land on French shores in one day, 1 million following a month later. Okay, so March 1945, we have the Allied forces cross the Rhine River into Germany, and in May of that year, we see Hitler commits suicide, and Germany surrenders, and finally in August, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, Japan surrenders, ending the war officially. So the results of World War II. So again, I've gone through this quickly just to give a context. What you're going to look at here is the Holocaust, because what we'll be reading again is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he discusses his days, now he was Jewish, within one of the concentration camps in Auschwitz, and we'll talk about this as we get into that book. So what happens during the Holocaust? You'll also be watching a video about genocide during the Second War, which is not just restricted to the German Holocaust. The video itself by the BBC is by the BBC. It's a terrible reality, and I think it's tough to watch. But make sure you watch that, because this is in fact one of the realities of our world, and it's good to be aware of this, so that there are certain truths about the historical experience of the human being that we should be aware of, and of course in many ways so that we don't repeat it, but also so that we don't forget these things. Okay, so the Holocaust begins with the mass killing of Jews in 1941 in German-occupied Soviet territory. 1942, as the war was reaching a peak, we see that the Nazi Party members, they actually gather together and they decide that the Jews must be outright and ultimately exterminated, man, woman, and child. And this is called the final solution to the Jewish question. Now, I want you to think about that these Nazi Party members actually got together in a conference room, and they went over and the question, and they asked, what should we do with all these Jewish people? We have all these Jewish people in these camps. We can't quite feed them. What do we do with them? And here we have men, women, and children in these camps, and they come to the decision, this terrible decision, well, let's just murder them. You see? You can only imagine how could such individuals come to such a decision. It's absolutely unbelievable, and yet it occurred. So over 3 years following this, 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, and it wasn't just Jews at all as well, it was communists, any dissenters against National Socialism, the gypsies throughout Europe as well, and they perished in camps, including almost all of the Polish Jews. So the total casualties of the war, Europe and Asia, many of which were in fact sustained by the Russians as well, were some 60 million people lost their lives during the war. And a lot of the reasons for this had to do with the fact that some of the tactics used in the war included deliberate assaults. And this was on both sides. It wasn't just on the German and Russian side. It was also on the U.S. and British side. But it included deliberate assaults upon civilians and civilian-occupied cities. We also had the results of these loss of lives from concentration camps and massacres on large scales, which I haven't mentioned, but also technological improvements in warfare machinery, which simply allowed for more widespread destruction. Let's proceed now to the second part of our discussion. We'll proceed to a discussion of psychotherapy. And here we see a picture of Sigmund Freud, who's really kind of seen as the modern founder of psychotherapy. So Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, he is an Austrian neurologist and psychologist, as I said, who is largely responsible for the development of psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis is, in fact, it's a method for treating neuroses. A neurosis is a psychological illness. And the basic idea of psychoanalysis is that it's the use of a form of dialogue for unearthing subconscious notions or feelings or ideas that we have within our mind or consciousness that have been built up over our history. And a lot of these ideas, these that we have had, they've resulted from usually from early childhood trauma. This is the idea that Freud has. And so they kind of come to the fore as certain types of strange behaviors or psychological expressions, usually, so for example, in dreams, they can come out symbolically through different types of symbols that we see in our dreams, or through the way that we look upon our family members or other people or our environment. Okay, so and psychoanalysis then emphasizes the influence of the unconscious and the irrational in human behavior, and again, along with something like Romanticism, we see that the notion of psychoanalysis that our rational lives are going to be somehow conducted or influenced by the irrational, this is going to challenge the traditional accounts where reason and the human will is the rule. So one of the things about Freud to recognize is that his basic view is that human beings are really motivated by our primitive urges, especially sexual desire. And so this is really going to influence the nature of Freudian psychoanalysis, and he'll come up with some very interesting, though in some cases strange views. For example, he'll have the notion of the Oedipus complex, the view that the child is somehow in love with the mother or father of the opposite sex and desires to have the father or the mother, okay, who is of the same sex, removed and to replace them, and also the view that that familial love is rooted in sexual love. Also the view that most or all of our fundamental psychological illnesses are rooted in some form of trauma which is sexual in nature. So you see that Freud really has this kind of reductionistic account of the human being, where our fundamental intellectual nature, okay, can be reduced to our physical nature. So he even has a view of what's called sublimation, the idea that our primitive urges, okay, a way of dealing with them is to kind of sublimate them, or to, let's say, to redirect them or channel them into intellectual forms, for which reason we see art and music as expressions of the human soul. So for Freud, these are just kind of expressions of our sexual nature being channeled into something else. And for Freud, he also has the view that, well, one of the ways to avoid neuroses is to kind of sublimate or redirect these sexual urges. So overall, though, it should be said that Freud's view of the human being is kind of dismal and in some ways very pessimistic. For that reason, what I've decided in this class is we'll be looking at Viktor Frankl, because he has a much more interesting, in my view, and very optimistic view of the human being, and he offers an alternative to Freudian psychotherapy, which he calls logotherapy. And you'll see that in his book, and I do hope that you'll read that. In fact, it's part of our reading. So Viktor Frankl is a very interesting individual as well. He's an Austrian neurologist and psychologist. He spends a number of years in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, where he has, in fact, first-hand experience of the types of suffering that people do experience and how people deal with these types of suffering. And there he develops his fundamental psychological and psychoanalytical ideas, including his notion of logotherapy. So logotherapy, for Viktor Frankl, it's a system of what he calls existential analysis. Now, this is just a form of psychological analysis, and the difference is that whereas Freud saw all the fundamental problems, okay, of human existence as rooted in some kind of disturbance at the level of our sex drive, Viktor Frankl sees most of our neurological problems when they're not rooted in something biological, which is very different. For example, you can have some kind of a biological illness which is the result of, finds its origin in the brain, and such, which results in psychological illness. In such cases, even psychoanalysis is not going to help. But so when we're talking about psychological illnesses having a root in something like the psychology of the human person, then we can see psychotherapy as having a kind of curative or a therapeutic nature as a way of dealing with that. So with logotherapy and existential analysis, the basic idea that Frankl had is that a lot of the neurological illnesses that human beings experience and develop in their lifetime is due to kind of fundamental existential crises that we encounter in our search for something meaningful in life. And what happens is that many people who lose meaning or lose sight of what's meaningful in life, they tend to fall into these kind of psychological existential crises, and this is what leads to illness for Frankl. I think, when you look at something like Frankl and Freud, I think you could probably bring their two views together into a more holistic system, because, Frankl's views are in many ways more intellectual, whereas Freud's views are from the opposite perspective, more naturalistic, more physiological. And I think bringing them together would give a full and complete psychoanalytical perspective on the human being. So again, what I'm going to do is just give a kind of quick overview of Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I do hope you'll read that. If there's one book that you read for this class, if you don't read anything else, and I certainly hope you read all of the books, because I've chosen the books for a purpose. They're all very interesting works, and I think that each of the books is something that you'll find very interesting to read. But this is the one book that I really hope that you do spend time reading. It's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, 1947. So it's divided into two parts, and the first part discusses his experience so it's a kind of autobiographical account of his experience in the concentration camp, and you'll really want to read that. And the second part discusses his particular perspective on psychoanalysis, which he calls logotherapy. So again, the first part is a biographical account or autobiographical account that recounts his days as a prisoner. And the book, now one of the things that's interesting is because you can find other books, which talk about experiences of individuals in concentration camps. There's another book, I know it's called The Periodic Table, which is another book that you could read if you have some time, which talks about a chemist's experience within a concentration camp. So now Frankl's book focuses not so much on events, but rather on how people interpreted and experience these events. Now remember, Frankl is a psychologist, and one of the things he says in the book at some point, he says, I could not believe the amount of suffering that I experienced, and he says, but one day, he kind of realized that, well, this type of suffering is something that can be explained psychologically, and we can talk about this on a psychological level. And he says that once he realized that, in some ways he was able to stand a bit apart from his suffering and to look at it objectively. So it's very interesting to see how that occurs and how he talks about that. You'll have to read that in the book. And so he discusses the way in which meaning within the camp and for these individuals in the concentration camps serves as a powerful motivator in the struggle for life in the face of death. Now, I've actually visited Poland a decade ago, and I actually went to Auschwitz to see the camp, the concentration camp, and I saw also another concentration camp there, Birkenau. It's very interesting when you look at the camp. They've preserved everything. It's kind of the entire camp is a kind of museum, almost like a mausoleum as well. It's a kind of museum of a place of death. And as you walk in there, there's written there's a gate there that says Arbeit macht frei, something along those lines, that work makes us free. And when you walk in, you can go into the different rooms, and in these different rooms where people first went into the camps, you see that they've actually preserved the clothing and the jewelry and even the hairs, and you see the clothing, you see them in piles that stretches up to the ceiling. You see the jewelry and the watches in rooms that completely fill the entire room. And the worst part was the hair. It was a large and a huge room full of hair, and the hair was almost perfectly preserved. And you can see one of them was just a sheared hair of braided locks just sort of laying there. And so you see, and you walk out and you can see actually where the people went into the gas chambers and where they were eventually put, their bodies were put into the furnaces where they were eventually the body was removed. So let's move on then to the second part. Part 3. So just as another point, so just make sure you read that book and make sure you look at his discussion and look at what he's trying to do within that book. And he's trying to say, look, how are people dealing with this suffering, and how is it that individuals who find meaning in their suffering, how does that help them to survive? So it's one of the fundamental points of the book, because what he wants to say is basically that those who found meaning in their suffering were those who were most likely to survive, whereas those who lost meaning or who saw nothing meaningful in their suffering, those were the ones who gave up, and those were the ones who died. And he gives explicit examples of this in his book. And I think, when you look at that, you can apply it to everyday life. For example, coming down with an illness, or hoping to find a job, or hoping to find something. All of us indeed are searching for something meaningful in life. And you can say, what happens to a person when they lose hope, when they lose sight of what's meaningful, and they kind of just say, look, life is meaningless? Well, generally, you see, they become depressed, and they can even become neurotic. So in many ways, what Frankl is saying, well, what he's saying has application. It does seem to really apply to what people experience in life. There is something about the search for meaning in life which gives life its fervor and strength and helps us to carry on, right? Okay, so coming to our third part, what I'm just going to do is just look over quickly some aspects of surrealism. And here we have a picture by Salvador Dali, some very odd pictures. So one of the things you want to recognize about psychotherapy is that, and let me move on to this next part, so is that psychotherapy through Freud and others, such as Jung, who was a student of Freud, and Viktor Frankl, who comes up with logotherapy, it begins to emphasize notions of the subconsciousness and how that affects our conscious life. One way to really recognize this is, for example, in our experience of dreams, because in dreams we really begin to encounter something like the subconsciousness sometimes telling us things that we have to interpret. And so one of the things that Freud does, for example, is he starts to make use of dream theory. Because in dreams, oftentimes we see various symbols, and these symbols, for example, persons or things that happen, and these symbols are not quite clear to us. And so what you see is the subconsciousness is really informing us of things that are floating around within us that are not known consciously, on a conscious level. And so Freud would often try to interpret these symbols, and other psychologists and psychoanalysts would do that as well. Now with surrealism begins to kind of pick up on these ideas and begins to make use of the subconsciousness as, let's say, as subject matter for art. Okay, and so this becomes the notion of surrealism. So it becomes a style of art, and not just art, but literature, music, a little bit of cinema as well, and popular culture that develops in the 20th century, the early 20th century. It emerges from or is related to Dadaism, which itself is going to be tied to later postmodern art, which is a pre-World War I form of kind of anarchist anti-art that deliberately defies reason. We've seen this already with Duchamp's The Fountain. Surrealism's emphasis was different, though, than Dadaism. It was more positive in expression. It sought to bring out the subconscious elements of our human experience in an artistic way, whereas Dadaism is a bit more negative and reactionary. So again, here's that example of Dadaism with Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain, which I've already discussed, and we'll have some time to discuss this a bit later when we turn to postmodern art. So some of the chief features of surrealism is that it seeks to unite the conscious and the unconscious realms of experience in a Freudian sense. This comes from André Breton's The Surrealist Manifesto, kind of a surrealist artist who discusses what surrealism is. It makes use of also automatism, which is drawn from poetry. And so this is a kind of practice in poetry where you try to kind of write without any control or regard for aesthetic or moral considerations. And so the artists, the painters, begin to make use of this form, and so some of them thought of their paintings as kind of visual poems. And so there's kind of an interesting analogy between poetry and surrealist art here. And so they saw their works as suggestive of some sort of meaning rather than just kind of describing a world. They also made use of the exploitation of chance effects or unexpected juxtapositions. In other words, what you often see in dreams is that you can see, for example, suddenly maybe your father might appear in your dream, and suddenly out of nowhere you see a friend from childhood, and you say, well, why are they both in my dream, and why are they both together in my dream? There seems to be no reason. Well, the subconsciousness throws these things together without any conscious reason. And so the surrealists, who were kind of modeling art off of the subconsciousness, tried to kind of model, kind of reproduce these types of effects. So let's look at the first artist, Max Ernst, who is French, though German-born. And here we see The Temptation of St. Anthony. So again, notice how what he depicts here is almost like a dream world or a fantasy world in which you have all these strange visual images, these monsters tossed together. And so kind of reproducing something that you might see within fiction or within a dream, a kind of nightmare, right? So what's interesting also is the use of color. So notice that the surrealists are not quite, they're certainly not abstract artists, right? But they are playing off the post-impressionists and how they start to exploit space and form and color in ways so that they can express their ideas. Well, what the surrealists are doing here is they're trying to express the symbols of the subconsciousness that we experience. Here's another one, Max Ernst's Europe After the Rain, #2. So what you see here is kind of a depiction of Europe after the war. Okay, and so you see many symbols here, and you see the interesting use of colors that kind of brings out that dismal scene. Here's just a picture of Ernst and his wife Dorothea Tanning playing, looks like chess. Another very interesting surrealist painter is René Magritte, who was Belgian. And take a look at this. We have the Eye, 1932. And this sort of expression there, art evokes the mystery without which the world would not exist. What do you think he's trying to say in this painting? So notice this, when I ask that question, right, I'm asking you to interpret the painting. So as soon as you ask that question, you see, you're saying, what is the meaning and the intention of the author? And so, of course, you have to recognize that you have already thought of a meaning, right? And you have to be aware of that meaning that you have, but you also have to be aware that your meaning might not be exactly what the author or painter, him or herself, has. And so you need to kind of bring out that meaning that's before you. And so this is the nature of interpretation. I think in this case we can kind of maybe find an interpretation, though we could be wrong. But you think of the eye there, and what's that saying about the eye? The eye is what? The window to the soul. So it seems that here Magritte might be commenting on that old saying there, and that somehow he's saying something about this, that when you look into someone's eyes, or that the eye that we see, it's not everything that's there, or something that peering into the eye is peering into the subconsciousness and the soul. All these different things. Here we have another interesting work, and notice here that we have the picture in which there's a painting before the window, and the painting itself, the portrait, actually reveals what's just outside. So if you would remove the portrait, you'd see precisely what's there, except that the easel would no longer be there. So you and this is called the human condition. And again, we can try to interpret, and I'll try to interpret, and let's see, what you think, and perhaps you'll think something different, but that's fine. So you could almost say that what you're looking at is kind of the way in which we as human beings view our world, right? So as soon as we open our eyes, in some ways, we're like the vision that we see, the picture that we see as soon as we open our eyes is like that picture which is before the window, that somehow our mind, our consciousness, is like a portrait, and what's cast upon that portrait, the vision, the the spectacle that we see is kind of a representation, and we're representing as the portrait, as the painting, a world that's before us. So is he saying that? I'm not quite sure. It's just an interpretation which I'm trying to offer. Now, just so you know, this is kind of a very open interpretation. You could try to get more, you can try to offer a deeper interpretation. To do so, what you would have to do is, in fact, examine all of Magritte's works. You would have to examine the historical time frame out of which he painted his works. You could examine his life. You can examine other painters that he was in contact with. You could examine his manuscripts. And you can try to work into a kind of large and evolving interpretation so that maybe at some point you could come to a rather sophisticated interpretation where you can start to understand what was Magritte really trying to say. Maybe he's made comments about the work itself. Maybe not very explicit, maybe more implicit comments, but you see there are better interpretations, right? And here we have René Magritte, the Son of Man. I think here we can actually come to an interesting interpretation. So the Son of Man, who is the Son of Man? Okay, well, there's certainly Christ was called the Son of Man in the New Testament, but also we have Adam, right, is the first man in some ways. And what happens with the story of Adam and Eve? Okay, there's an apple, right, in the Garden of Eden, and there's an apple. And what happens in the Garden of Eden? Well, Eve gives Adam the apple, and after they eat the apple, they awaken, right? They awaken to their nudity. And so here, interestingly, the apple covers the eyes of the man. It blinds him. And so it seems that Magritte is kind of commenting on that story in some way. Okay, so again, an interpretation. So here we have Salvador Dali, 1904 to 1989. If you ever get the chance, to go to a museum to see these paintings firsthand, really you should take the opportunity, because these painters were masterful. And here, when you look at the painting on screen, it just looks almost like a cartoon. But if you were to see it in a museum, you'd see that the technique is what makes all the difference in seeing that actual painting. So here we have the persistence of memory. This is a very interesting picture, and you can actually come up with an interesting interpretation here. Notice how all of the objects have a clock on them, right? So memory, what happens in memory? For example, think about where you were yesterday, and think about your birthday last year. Notice that every time you think of a memory, your mind goes back to a certain time, right? So somehow, all of your memories, there's a clock and a time on each of your memories. Is this what Dali's saying? That everything that we recall has a time signature to it? That there's a kind of clock tied to all of our memories and experiences? Perhaps, and perhaps not. Maybe there's another interpretation that's possible. And here we have Salvador Dali, a self-portrait. So he was a very interesting fellow. He gave a lecture one time in a complete dry suit, a kind of swimmer's dry suit. Very interesting, strange guy. Okay. Here we have Salvador Dali again, Geopoliticus child watching the birth of the new man. So this is a picture which is really interesting surrealistically, because you see this juxtaposition of these strange images. You see this almost something which would be from a bad dream, right? In ways, and there's a lot of symbol going on in this work. Okay. And finally, we have this Mae West, 1935, oil on canvas. You see here, it's almost like something like Alice in the Wonderland, right? Something very strange. Oops, and there's one more here. We have the burning giraffe. Okay, and the painting refers to, I have written here, what is hidden or the subconscious in man. The burning giraffe is a symbol of strife or war. And so that wraps it up for Surrealism and for the lecture, and I'll see you next time.